We have two very different research conversations today. I'm looking forward to them very much. The first by Dr. Arezou Azad, who is a senior research fellow in the faculty, will be a conversation about her work with Professor Edmund Herzig, the Sudavar Professor of Persian Studies. And I hand over Ed and Arezou to you.
Arezou seems to have left. I was expecting her to go first. So while we're waiting for her to come back, I'll just say that we're going to be talking about her Invisible East umbrella project, which actually is a sort of umbrella for two separate research projects, which Arezou leads, an AHRC project and a European Research Council project. Here is Arezou. So Arezou, I've just been holding the fort in your momentary absence, but I think I'm going to take over now. The idea is that you're going to present first, then I'm going to ask you a couple of questions.
Thank you. Sorry, I lost connection there for a minute. Can you hear me, everybody? Yeah. Okay. Let me share my screen, if I may. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Okay. Wonderful. So thank you so much for inviting me. Let me just get into the right view. Right. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here today and to be in conversation with my colleague and friend and former DPhil supervisor, Ed Herzig. And I look forward to questions questions from my colleagues in the audience later on. Our research program, Invisible East, which is funded by the ERC, AHRC, and the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, studies the administrative and legal documents and literary fragments from the Eastern Islamicate world during the 8th to the 13th centuries of the Common Era, which in the scholarship is sometimes referred to as Eastern Iran. This includes parts of modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, Central Asia, and Western China. We explore relations between the diverse confessional, ethnic, and linguistic communities who lived here, that is, Muslims, Jews, Zoroastrians, Buddhists, Christians, followers of local cults, and more. And the empty niche of one of the large Buddhas of Bamiyan, destroyed by the Taliban 20 years ago, depicted here on the slide, is an important reminder of that diversity, given that the statues had remained throughout much of 1300 years of Islamic rule here. These local communities have left behind an astonishingly rich and diverse set of texts written in many different languages and scripts. We are working only on 7 languages and 6 scripts, that is New Persian, Judeo-Persian, Bactrian, Middle Persian, Sogdian, Arabic, and Khotanese. All of these, incidentally, belong to the Iranian language family, with the exception of Arabic, of course. So, what we want to know, we investigate, first of all, the legal, economic, and political foundations upon which the eventual Islamization of the communities rested in this period. Secondly, we want to understand the way languages influenced the nature, extent, and results of Islamization. And thirdly, we look for variations in those foundations and interactions over time and from place to place within this highly diverse region. So let's take a closer look at our world in this time. We are in the eastern fringe of the Islamicate world during the first 500 years of Muslim rule and or presence in the area. This is the time when the Abbasid Caliphate rules, which is centered in Baghdad, indicated here with a blue place marker. Our eastern Iranian region, indicated by this rather crude green circle has been in quite a bit of a blind spot as far as scholarship is concerned, falling between the cracks due to the traditional focus of two concerned fields. The first is Islamic history, which has focused to a large extent on everything west of this region, notably Iraq as the caliphal center, but also Western Iran, Syria, Egypt, Spain, and North Africa. You can see the area circumscribed by the orange boundary in this slide. On the other hand, the Iranian studies field, which has a more direct interest in the region, of course, has approached the region with a focus to a large extent on philology, most notably in Germany, and book editions, in particular in Iran. And the historical period of interest has been either the pre-Islamic period or the post-13th century period, that is Mongol and post-Mongol history. And so the period in between 8th to the 13th century, which we focus on, and notably the local sources from here, have been left outside the traditional historical narrative. This is why we see as our main goal making the voices from Eastern Iran heard and bringing them into our understanding of what happened here when the Muslims arrived. I think it's obvious that we have set ourselves no small task, which requires highly specialist and niche expertise, given the blend of languages we need to tackle. I have to say that the faculty have done a stellar job at helping us get the specialists on the team, each with their own particularly challenging circumstances, and throughout the entire period of the pandemic. We began our recruitment in March 2020, and we recruited our latest postdoc last week. We now have a fantastic and truly multidisciplinary team on site, so to speak, of historians and philologists. So I'm the PI and work as a historian and Persianist. Then we have a fantastic group of postdocs and research associates shown here. Zhanjiang is a specialist of ancient Iranian languages I mentioned and has joined us from China via Harvard. Tommy Benfi is a historian of late Sasanian and early Islamic Iran and is our Middle Persian and Arabic specialist who has joined us from Princeton. Majid Montazer Mahdi is a specialist of Islamic law and works with me on New Persian and joined us this week after submitting his PhD at Exeter. Pejman Firuzbakhsh is our Afghan Persian documents guru and works with us out of Hamburg and Kiel universities in Germany. And last but not least, Hugh Kennedy, who's known to many of us in this call probably, and was also working with Edmund and myself on the Balch project some years ago at the OI, has come back as co-investigator on the AHRC grant. Hugh's long and deep research on caliphal centers in Iraq, but also on court and administrative systems, has provided hugely important intellectual input as we compare that central view with what we find in our very local sources from further east, so to speak. Altogether, we are currently working with corpora that constitute around 1,000 texts, most of which have so far, as I said, been left out of the historical narrative. Some of the sites from which they came lay beyond the big centers of power, but I hasten to add that these are no rural backwaters. So let's get to the first one. Rob in northern Afghanistan was an agricultural metropolis that lay between the cities of Balch and Bamiyan, and from which we have 250 or so Bactrian documents, mostly written in Bactrian, but quite a few also written in Arabic. Tabaristan and Qom, situated in modern-day Iran, have left us with Middle Persian documents. Mount Mur in today's Uzbekistan has left us with Sogdian documents. Khotan in today's Xinjiang province of Western China has left us with hundreds of Khotanese documents, secular and religious. And we also have Arabic documents from this region. Finally, Bamiyan and the adjacent Gur region have left us with several sets of Persian documents, some written in Judeo-Persian, others in New Persian, and I'll show an example in a minute. and a smaller set of Arabic documents, some of which pertain to family and other archives. The documents are important sources not only on account of their content, but also their form and materiality. Here's an example of a Persian Afghan document, which, as you can see, displays two different scripts, Hebrew and Arabic. Both are written in the Persian language. These are some of the earliest Persian documents written in Arabic script known. The set also includes, also includes a small group of literary fragments, such as the one numbered 3 on the slide, that are also highly unusual, but I won't talk about them now. Many of them are written on reused paper, which adds another fascinating layer of discovery. Why were the documents retained, deaccessioned, resold? We're inspired by scholars who have worked on the Cairo Geniza since Shlomo Goy time. On that point, a word on how we approach our research. We read our texts and documents as empirical evidence through an iterative process, first by a single researcher, which is then cross-checked by another Invisible East researcher or buddy, then in a wider group of outside experts through reading workshops. And here on the slide, I've shown you a snapshot of our workshop with Iranian scholars we held over Zoom. Then, secondly, we cross-reference with other documents and narrative and material culture sources in our commentary on these in order to identify patterns, continuities, or innovations in documentary, scribal, and archival practice. Then, thirdly, we will create a first-time digital corpus of Eastern Islamicate texts. This is the digital humanities component of our program, and our aim is to make all these data searchable and publicly accessible and interoperable with other existing corpuses, such as the Princeton Geniza database. We are linked up with the DH community that is growing fast on Islamicate texts and have worked on our metadata and are moving on to tagging. So using our corpus, we will then get to the last point, which is to analysis, where we try to answer our questions on the foundations of and influences on Islamization I spoke about earlier. And I've actually finished. Just a final word to say that we are keen on reaching out to wider audiences through our Twitter page, which is the Invisible East Twitter page, and are also planning online courses and podcasts and events. We're obviously still in the early stages of our program, but that is all I had to say at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Arezou. So I'm going to make sure that I leave some time for questions from the audience. So I'm going to keep what I say pretty brief. I want to begin just by congratulating you on these projects. I think it's fantastic that you managed to get the funding to put together this incredible team. I'm sure that wasn't easy, and you, again, that's something which creates a very encouraging and exciting prospect for the work that you'll be able to do and the results that you'll be able to achieve. And I also want to thank you for bringing the projects to Oxford. I think that I hope that the Faculty of Oriental Studies will be a very good home for your project. I think I can see so many ways in which the work that you're doing intersects with the interests of colleagues in several parts of the faculty. So I'm delighted that the project is here. The geographical area and the time period that you're working on is a really fascinating one, historically, as we know. And I've got so many questions that I'm tempted to ask too much and take up too much time. You've talked about Islamization, and that clearly is one very interesting and important development in this period. You mentioned the linguistic diversity, But of course, this is also an extremely interesting and still really quite puzzling period from the point of view of language history. It's in this very area, more or less sort of right in the middle of your green circle, somewhere, you know, where the modern borders of Afghanistan, Iran, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan meet, is where New Persian emerged as a literary language, you know, a couple of centuries or a century and a half into the Islamic period. And, you know, Persian is a southwest Iranian language, and we still in many ways are puzzling over why it emerged there in the way that it did. And then, of course, many of these other exciting languages that you're working with, Khotanese and Bactrian and Sogdian, which were used both as written and vernacular languages in that region, by and large seem to have been displaced by Persian around this time. That's also extremely interesting, problematic, and I hope that your research is going to shed light on that. But for the one area that I'm going to actually ask a question about now, rather than just suggesting all the interesting things that we might talk about if we had more time, I would like to focus on the documents themselves. You showed us some very teasing snapshots of some of the materials you're going to be working with. And it makes me wonder about the administrative and documentary culture of this area. I mean, you've characterized it sort of as a region in a way, and I guess you're looking for the points of similarity and difference across it. And I'm just wondering whether it's too early still, or whether you're already able to say anything about whether the kinds of documents that you have, the way that they're put together, the terminology, the language, the documentary culture is something which sort of suggests a single region or a connected region, or whether we find actually very different kinds of documents and forms in Khotan from Tabaristan, for example. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Sure, certainly. Thanks for that intervention and really good question. I should just say that I think the entire team is in on this call. So if any of them would like to jump in at any point, please do. But yeah, so it's a really good question. So what we've been doing so far is, first of all, we've had to come to grips with these documents and see what they are. So some of them, you know, the Persian ones from Afghanistan, almost none of them have ever been published or been subject of any sort of in-depth scholarly study. So first of all, we're just reading, transcribing, translating, figuring out who's who, what are the place names, what institutions can we detect here, what kind of decision-making mechanisms are in place here, because these are mostly legal and economic documents. However, that said, at the same time, we're already starting to look at documentary practices and where we might find continuities or innovations. So, for example, yesterday, we had a fascinating meeting with another ERC team at Exeter, which is looking at Mughal Persian documents. Not only Persian, these are also often bilingual, like ours. And we looked at specifically this legal type of document called Iqrar, which is like an acknowledgement statement, an acknowledgement deed. And we compared them with ours 500 years earlier. And we were able to recognize echoes from that 500-year earlier document. But then again, we could also see where things had changed. And so we're doing the same now with our Afghan 11th century documents, when comparing to the Khotanese documents or the Bactrian and Sogdian or Middle Persian documents that Tommy and Zizi are working on, but we're just starting. So I can't really give you some major findings as yet, but it's certainly something we are looking at very closely right now to understand what is the legal process here, who has the authority, when do you need witnesses, when don't you, who are the witnesses, are these sort of representatives of institutions or local village elders? And we see both, and we're trying to detect trends, or we're trying to see maybe things change over time, or things change depending on the type of topic that is discussed, or that is the issue in these documents. And we're very lucky also to have Majid on the team, having just joined us, who has this Islamic law background and can then compare with sort of legal fiqh books, for example, and so on. So it's very much a topic for us. But what's still fascinating is that we find a lot of commonalities, and what we also find is a pretty sophisticated documentary practice, whether you're in Khotan, or you're in Bactrian in the 8th century, or you're in this rural area of relatively rural, not backwater, but rural metropolis of between Balkh and Bamiyan. So if I can share my screen, I'll show you some examples of that. I don't know how much time we still have a bit of time. So here can you see this? Yeah, so here, for example, is a Bactrian document from the 8th century. So we're sort of 40 years into Islamic rule. It's written in the Bactrian language. It's written at a time when we also have other documents that are written in Arabic, but this one is written in Bactrian, and it's following what is a long-term practice, because the Bactrian corpus goes back to the 4th century. So we have a continuity of practice that we can detect. But what's interesting here, just to show how sophisticated this practice is the top bit that is rolled up and sealed is actually a duplicate copy that is kept. If ever there is any suspicion of any tampering with what's written in the document, you can open up the top sealed version and make sure you can double check. So that just shows quite a sophisticated practice. The other one is we detect lots of formulaic phrases. So that shows you that this is based on some kind of law book, which unfortunately we currently is lost to us. But there was clearly a professionalization behind the writing of these. And here from the Afghan set, 300 years later, the reason why I put this one in is because these are both, by the way, family archives. So we're not talking in these two cases about state archives, but what this shows is that this family archive, for example, on the other side of it, which I haven't shown you, it has a ledger. Yeah, and we find a lot of these ledgers. And you can also see from the fold lines that these have been folded for archival reasons. But the ledgers are here, in this case, for example, are written in Judeo-Persian. Here you have a Persian document. The letter, however, is written in Judeo-Persian. So the ledger not only shows you that whoever kept this archive felt more comfortable writing in in Hebrew script, but it also, the name that's given in the ledger is indicates to you who must have kept this. Because you would never write about yourself with a name, right? So it's just we're looking for these little clues that will help us understand the archival practices as well. And we're finding them. But we first need to read them all. Then we start looking for common clues, like handwriting, for example. We're starting to identify handwritings. We're starting to identify names of people who crop up across different documents, and then slowly, we can understand what's going on. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Yes, and as I said, in the interest of time, I'm going to refrain from further questions, although I have many.
You're muted, Martin.
Thank you. That was very confident. It's a wonderful project. If people have questions or comments, if they could send me a little note in the chat, then I can call on them. While waiting for one to come through, if I could start us off, it's on your alternative title of Eastern Iran. Are you expecting by the end Eastern Iran to cease to be an appropriate title for the Islamicate East?
I always avoid that name anyway. I don't like it, just because people might confuse it with, you know, modern day Iran and sort of greater Iran, ideas of greater Iran. I use it only because you find it a lot in the scholarship still. But yeah, maybe we can change. We have a paradigm shift coming out of this. I wouldn't like to call it Eastern Iran, but equally some people don't want to call it Eastern Islamicate, because that might be misconstrued as this being a Muslim area when Muslims at this time are still in the minority. So there is no perfect term. So all I can say, I don't know if anyone else wants to, if Ed wants to add to that. No.
So I wonder how far abroad you're looking for parallels with your documents. Your double document looks very similar to what you find in antiquity. So you find very similar things in the Judean desert in the 2nd century. And I wonder whether you're finding influences coming from the West and from the East.
Yes. Yes, we are actually. It's a good question. Thank you. So we're going west, east, and we're going forward and backwards in time. But so for the Afghan documents, our first port of call is currently the Cairo Geniza. Yeah, so we're working quite closely with the team in Princeton. But for the Bactrian, Sogdian, Middle Persian documents, I know that Nicholas Sims-Williams has looked at these kinds of documents you referred to, Martin. What are they called? The 2nd century Jewish documents. Yeah. So we're certainly currently culling all this sort of scholarship together, and we're keeping an open mind definitely in our comparisons.
Great. I got time for one more question, I think, from Charles Ramble, the centre. Question, if you unmute yourself.
Thanks very much. Yeah, great project. Very nice to see it taking shape so nicely. The question is a very practical one. I mean, you talked about the materiality of the documents you're working with. It wasn't clear to me how much physical access you're going to have to the documents themselves, and whether it's actually going to be possible to do any sort of paper analysis, for instance.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So currently we're working with images, obviously in COVID anyway, but even after things normalize. Some of us, I mean, I've visited the ones in the National Library of Israel in Jerusalem, but some of us in the team won't be able to travel there for obvious reasons. But we are in touch with the team in Jerusalem. They have a machine that's been given to them by the Hamburg team, Berlin actually, someone in Berlin, but I know that the Institute of Manuscript Cultures in Hamburg may also be interested in getting involved. So we're starting to think about also looking at the physical things. But, you know, for example, some documents that we look at, there are some folds, and we can tell that there's some text under the folds. So it could also just be a matter of contacting the colleagues in the archive, asking them to take a picture and sending it to us. So it might not necessarily require us to be physically present, but you're absolutely right that to understand the materiality, you should really be working with the actual physical object as much as possible. The Bactrian documents are in London in a private archive, but it's sort of semi-private. It's quite open to scholars, so that might be something we could pursue as well. Thanks.
Arezou, thank you very much indeed. It's a wonderful project, and congratulations to you and indeed all the rest of the team who I can see popping up within the audience, even if I can